So I want to welcome everyone who's here. I want to welcome everyone who's streaming the service online. We're just so glad to have you guys with us this morning. And I want to say a quick word about that. So next weekend, we're going to start a series here. We're calling the series Dollars and Cents, S-E-N-S-E. And we're going to talk about how to make sense of our money. And I want to say a couple things about this. I'm really excited about this series, number one. Number two is we talk about this topic only once or twice a year. So if you're visiting here today or you're streaming online for the first time, you're trying to figure out church and all this, we are not unself-aware, okay, community folk. We understand the awkwardness about talking about money and church, so I want to just tell everybody in the room, okay, just relax. Okay, just everybody take a breath right now. Very good. All right. And we're going to talk about this. And here's my goal next week when we come together. This is what the zone is I told Pastor Trevor and I we're going to hit. We're going to be helpful. Everybody want helpful? We're going to be instructive. Who wants instructive? We're going to be inspiring. Who wants inspiring? We're going to be a little challenging. That was a little colder. All right. But here's what we're going to not be. We're not going to be churchy or weird. How's that? Okay, so come. You'll be glad you did. Bring some friends. We have a lot of folks who are going through, over 300 folks right now in our church going through something called Momentum. And we're all learning how to manage our money better. We have lots of young families in our church, and we're all struggling with this. The number one struggle in marriage today, number one reason for conflict is money fights and money problems. And so we're trying as a church to be helpful and inspiring and go at this topic. So just want to share that with you. All right, reach into your Connect folder and grab your notes. And we're going to continue on. We are in a series. We're calling a series Upside Down. Say it with me. Upside Down. This is the last week of our series. And in this series, I want to talk and I want to begin the subject of the day a little bit differently. Okay? We have been talking about the resurrection. And we have been talking about how Jesus gathered around him this small group of people, and this small group of people changed the world. It's sort of interesting to think about that you and I are here, whether you understand this or not. Most of us, probably all of us, are here because of this small group of people that Jesus pulled around him, that as they got to understand who he was, they saw his life, the way he lived his life, they saw his death, they saw his resurrection, and they saw what he was trying to teach, and they owned it, and as a result of owning it, began to live it and express it into the world. The world had never seen it before. Some stuff began to roll and change. The world changed, and we're here as a result of that. If you kind of pin it all down, that's the kind of idea. But this is a question I want to ask as we begin this morning. Did you ever wondered actually how that happened? How that actually took place? And I've been doing a lot of studying about this and thinking about this and trying to distill some of these ideas. And so this morning, I want to point out what I believe was a huge part of the story, but I'm going to do it from a little bit of a different angle to get our minds and hearts around this topic. You open to that being a little different today? So here's what I'm going to do. We're going to have a little bit of a challenge in the room. And what I'm going to do in just a few moments, I'm going to put some faces of some people on the screens. I'm going to let you see the faces. And we're going to see if you recognize any of them. Some of them you may know, some of them you will not know, okay? And if anybody knows them all, we have a canned ham we will give you, and you get to win the canned ham. Okay, so that's what we're going to do now. Because it's a little bit of a challenge this morning, I think we ought to kind of, first of all, we've added a new guy to our team, our tech team. His name is Stephen Pippin. He's at the board. Would you welcome Stephen back there? There he is. And hey, Stephen, can you help me out? You got some music, bro, that would help us with this, okay? All right, that'd be great. There he is. Okay, all right, so because it's a challenge. No, never mind. All right, okay, all right. That was better last night, okay. All right, so I'm going to show you this first person, and I'm going to see if you can guess who this is. Okay, this would be one I wouldn't think you would know, okay? Her name is actually Susanna Wesley. Okay, all right. Let me tell you about Susanna. Herself, she was the 25th of 25 children, okay? And she married her husband Samuel, who was an Anglican priest, in 1688, and they had 19 children, 9 of which died in infancy. Okay? Imagine that. And like I said, her husband was a Anglican priest, but he wasn't really good at it. In fact, he was kind of terrible at it. And he almost left his family, his large family, penniless twice, once going away for a year to serve in a debtor's prison. And I think that's true because, I mean, we would all understand this, right? Dave Ramsey had not yet been born. He had not taken FPU. Okay? And while he was gone for a period of a year, Susanna wrote her husband, and this is what she wrote. I want you to listen carefully to what she said. Now, understand the time when this would have happened, but this is what she wrote. She said, "I'm a woman, but I'm also a mistress to a large family." That was not a derogatory term back then. She said, and though the superior charge of the souls contained in our family lies upon you, Samuel, yet in your long absence I cannot but look upon every soul you leave under my charge as a talent committed to me under a trust. I am not a man nor a minister, and yet as a mother and mistress I feel I ought to do more than I'd yet done before. So I resolve now to begin with my children, and I'm writing to tell you about it, in which I will observe the following method. I will take such a portion of time every day, every night, to discourse with each child apart and alone. On Monday, I will talk to Molly. On Tuesday with Hetty. Wednesday, Nancy. Thursday, Jack. Friday, Patty. Saturday with Charles, and then eventually John. Okay? So she began to do that, and notice the words that she said. They are talents committed to me under trust. Eventually, she started a Bible study in the small town of Epworth where they lived. Now, when Samuel was preaching, about 10 or 15 people would come. When she started her Bible study, she drew real quickly. She had over 200 people coming. Boom. Almost the town of Epworth. Okay? And she continued on in this fashion to discipline, but she will be remembered and immortalized really not for her ministry in the church, but her ministry in her home. And in fact, she gave birth, as I've mentioned, to 2 kids you may remember. One is Charles, the great hymn writer who wrote such standards as "Hark the Herald Angels Sing," that we sing at Christmas, or "Oh, for a Thousand Tongues to Sing." And of course, there was John, the preacher who sparked the Great Awakening, okay, of which this church is in the lineage of that tradition. We named our younger daughter after her. Our younger daughter's name is actually Shelley Susanna Locke. And we told her we expect 19 grandchildren. Just saying. Okay? All right? All right. Want to show you another picture, okay? Anybody know who that is? No, but that's a good guess. Not George Whitefield. It's actually John Newton. Okay? John Newton was nurtured by a Christian mother, but he was raised by a reprobate father who raised him after his mother died at 7 of tuberculosis. And John Newton wrote of his own self. He said, "I was an unruly and undisciplined child and teenager." He was eventually conscripted, which means he was forced into Her Majesty's service in the Royal Navy, and he served on the HMS Harwich in 1734, a ship that was eventually deserted. And after being caught and publicly flogged, he was able to talk his superiors into discharging him to a slave ship so he could continue his reckless lifestyle. And he went on to this slave ship, and he took up employment with a slave trader by the name of Clow, who owned a plantation of lemon trees on a small island off of West Africa. And Newton went there totally to continue his reprobate lifestyle, but he was mistreated by this hateful and vicious man. And he eventually left that place and was again conscribed to the service of Her Majesty's Royal Navy. And he wound up in a ship by the name of Greyhound. And in 1744, while the ship was en route back to Liverpool, England, it encountered a harsh storm. Newton had been reading a book called Thomas à Kempis's The Imitation of Christ. And in fear and the connection of those two things, here's what happened. He gave his life to Christ. And as a result of giving his life to Christ, he would later write about this. He said, I had an experience, honestly, not unlike the Apostle Paul, where I felt like the scales were removed from my eyes, and I began to see my life for what it really could be, and I began to see my life for what it was before I came to Christ. And he began to see slavery as for the scourge that it really is. And he dedicated the rest of his life to the eradication of slavery. Interestingly, when he came back to England, he fell under the ministry and teaching of John and Charles Wesley. Remember them? And he began to start a Bible study in England, and he got a friend of his by the name of John Cowper together, and they would take popular tunes and write Christian lyrics to the tunes. You may remember one of them. It's the song and the hymn, Amazing Grace. In fact, why don't we sing it? Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found. Was blind, but now I see. When you understand John Newton's story, you'll never sing that hymn quite the same way again. Who saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found. I was blind, but now I see. And the eradication of slavery for John Newton became what he said was the defining, watch this, purpose of his life. Okay? Can I go on? Want to see another one? Do you know who this is? Anybody? This is Florence Nightingale. Now, I mean, we might never really know of Florence Nightingale were it not for a prayer that she prayed early and often. She was just a statistician that worked for the government, but as a result of her prayer, she became a social reformer, and frankly, she is what we remember her as the mother of modern nursing. And even to this day, when nurses are commissioned into service, they are oftentimes given a pin with her silhouette on the pin. Florence Nightingale. And this is where really we would understand it sort of historically, I think this way. It was during the Crimean War she volunteered to train and organize nurses for the care of wounded soldiers. But this is where the prayer would come in. She would tell us that one of her early, often, and lifetime prayers was simply this, that God would give to her a task that would define her life. And that God would give her the capacity and the ability to recognize it when he did. And so out of this sense of calling and her volunteer work, she began to document, catalog, and participate in what became her defining purpose. And so now every time you go to a hospital or you go to a doctor's office and a nurse really, really cares for you, you ought to thank Florence Nightingale. Can I go on? Feel the theme picking up in the room? Anybody know who this is? This is Rosa Parks. She is known as the mother of modern-day civil rights movement, but she was a devoted follower of Jesus Christ. She was a seamstress by profession, but as we may remember, she became famous for a refusal to obey a bus driver's demand that she give up her seat to sit in what was then called the colored section of a bus in Montgomery, Alabama, December 1, 1955. She became so famous, in fact, she's only one of 5 civilians ever to lie in state in the Capitol Rotunda at her passing. The 5th person just did that recently. Do you know who it was? Billy Graham. Okay? Not Barbara Bush, because this was non-political service. Only 5 in our nation's history. And she writes later on of this experience in her book entitled Quiet Strength. that she was given this conviction, she said, I felt the Lord himself would give to me a purpose and then give to me the strength to endure whatever I had to face. And this did away, she said, this understanding did away with all my fear. And it was, in that moment, she said, I learned it was time for someone to stand up, or in my case, sit down and refuse to move on. Okay? Let me show you quickly two others. Anybody know who this person is? Absolutely. That's Chuck Colson. And in fact, we might recognize the name, some of us do. You may better recognize him as special counsel to then President Richard Nixon. But inside the Beltway, he was known categorically as Nixon's hitman. And he was not a nice guy. And in 1974, around that time, many of us remember, we went into a time in our history known as Watergate. And he was eventually convicted as one of the original, what's called Watergate 7, which is the people who put this together. And he was convicted of a crime and sent off to serve at Maxwell Federal Prison in Alabama. Interestingly, however, in 1973, shortly before his sentence was to begin, he committed his life to Christ and invited the power of Christ to redeem his life. Watch this. And use it for God's purpose. And following his brief prison stay, never could quite get the faces and the smells and the sounds of prison out of his system. And so he started a ministry called Prison Fellowship International and dedicated his life to it. And to this day, it is the single largest prison ministry on the planet. And so God took the brokenness and the dishonesty and the mean-spiritedness of his life and reformed that and used it for his purpose. I want to show you one more. You may know her. Anybody? This is Danielle Strickland. And Danielle Strickland, most recently, was a Salvation Army officer. But before that, she was just another troubled kid in Toronto, Canada, involved in crime and drugs. Nothing really unique about that. But somewhere in the midst of her deepening despair, she found God. And more specifically, she found the love of Jesus Christ. And this is what she said: it wrecked me like nothing else had ever done so before. And so what does a young Canadian girl do after she gives her life to Christ? Well, she joined the Salvation Army. And it was here that God would reveal to her her purpose. And in 2003, as a Salvation Army officer, she started something called the War College at the Salvation Army. And the War College was simply designed with its purpose to equip and enlist warriors to win the world for Jesus Christ. But of her particular passion, listen to this, became the abolition of the human sex trafficking that is taking place in our world. And because of her courage and her willingness as a Christ follower, she has gone where Jesus has led her to some of the most dangerous and seedy places in the world and in the United States to rescue young women from the horror of sex trafficking and prostitution. A few years back, she started a ministry called Brave. And the ministry of Brave works through, listen to this, the foster care system, which is one of the most frequently poached places by sex traffickers to find their victims. Do you know that? Her simple idea with Brave is this: why can't the church reach and rescue these girls before the traffickers do? Why can't it? Now, the reason I share all these these faces is I just have a real simple question. Every one of them, God has used in some way to begin to change the world. Okay? And I have a simple question. Is that only for them that they would find their purpose? Are they unique Or are we just like them? And we must find our purpose. I want to show you one other picture. It's the Apostle Paul. And the Apostle Paul wrote in the book of Acts, chapter 20, beginning in verse 17. He's in trouble again. Paul is always in trouble. And he says this, "From Miletus, Paul sent to Ephesus for the elders of the church. And when they arrived, he said to them, 'You know how I lived the whole time I was with you. From the first day I came into the province of Asia, I served the Lord with great humility and with tears in the midst of severe testing by the plots of the Jewish opponents. You know that I've not hesitated to preach anything that would help you, but have taught you publicly and from house to house. I have declared to both Jews and Greeks that they must turn to God in repentance and have faith in Jesus. And now, listen to this, compelled by the Spirit, I'm going to go to Jerusalem. And I don't know what's going to happen to me there.' Listen to this. 'I only know that in every city the Holy Spirit warns me that prison and hardships are facing me. However, I consider my only aim is to finish the race, complete the task that the Lord Jesus has given me. The task of testifying to the good news of God's grace.'" So what Paul is saying, which I think is very, very interesting, and this idea that Paul is going forward and he wants to fulfill his purpose. He has really this only thing he wants to do. I want to fulfill my purpose. I want to run my race. I want to complete my task the Lord has given to me. And here's the question I want to ask everyone. Is he the only one who gets a task or a purpose? Or do you get one too? See, this is the fundamental question. And here's what I want us to think about long and hard. We've been talking about this series. We're calling a series Upside Down. And calling a series Upside Down, what we're saying is that God, through this fledgling group of people, began to bubble up within them these virtues. These virtues. And we've looked at the virtues, right? The first one being generosity. That out of their sheer religious conviction, they began to share with whatever small little excess they had to anybody else who had need. We talked about the value of humility, that they would take a position in a Roman Pax Romana world where they would suspend this idea to be better than somebody else, to push somebody else down, but to live with this general idea that we are all created in God's image and beautifully done so. And then lastly, kindness. The kindness began to bubble up in this small group of people, and it began to change the world. And so that God was up to something, but he was up to something in a very unique, very different way. So much so, we've been saying over these weeks as a theme verse, that Paul would write, God would choose the foolish things in 1 Corinthians 1:27 to shame the wise, and God would choose the weak things of the world to shame the strong. Here's what I'm driving at. But how did that happen? I mean, these virtues just popped up. But how did they run? What was the fuel that began to manifest these values across the burgeoning world, so much so that you and I would be sitting here today in Loxahatchee Groves and we'd be learning about this? Here's what I believe. It was when people began to see it and they began to recognize it and they began to get in tune with it and they began to open their lives to it, God would address a need in their life that every single person on the globe has. And it's the need for purpose. And so God would take the fuel of this little space that is in every human heart, and when people would see this beautiful expression of God's kingdom and get in touch with their purpose, it is that very thing coupled with those virtues that rolled together and has changed our world. Now, when I think about this, it drives me really to consider some interesting things. This is what I've been saying all these weeks. By the time we're done, Jesus is going to repair every single thing on the planet. That was a great spot for an amen. I only heard one. Okay? All right? In fact, there's a verse that John says in the last book of the Bible, book of Revelation. It's my favorite verse. You hear me say it from time to time. John wrote it this way. He said, there's still yet coming a day when God himself will remove all of our sorrow. There will be no more sorrow. Imagine. There will be no more crying. There will be no more pain. There will be no more brokenness. Imagine that. Because the old world and all of its evils will be gone forever, and God is going to do something new. You ever think about that? I mean, I want you to dream a bigger dream today. I was thinking about this, how God is, heaven spills over onto earth. God is bringing these changes. I remember when I was growing up, you know, I've told you before as a pastor, I think in images. And one year for Christmas, all I wanted was not a BB gun, okay? I wanted a fuel, real motorized plane that I could fly, model plane. It was called a Cox PT-19 Trainer. And you ever heard of those before, Cox? You put gas in them. I want to show you a picture. There it is. And this is all I wanted for Christmas. I wasn't sure I was going to get it. My mom and dad got it for me for Christmas. And on Christmas Day, we went out to the park to fly it. And you would put gas in it, you would light it up, you would turn it, and the motor would spark. I mean, it was the coolest thing on the planet back then, okay? And I got this plane, and you would fly it with this string attached to it so it wouldn't take off. I mean, it had a real motor. And so we went to fly it. It's Christmas Day. I just got this thing. I'd go down to the park with my dad. My family's watching. I go down there. I light it up. We light it up. We get it to go. And it goes around twice, and I didn't connect the strings right. Yeah, right. And like the second loop around, it disconnected from the strings. Pieces everywhere. We just it was like a movie scene, right? And I'll never forget, my dad and I, we went around, we picked up all the parts that we could find, and we went home on Christmas Day, and what we did in the afternoon is we tried to repair it. Isn't that awesome? But we couldn't repair it. It was gone. So my dad bought me another one. I mean, yeah. That's what God is going to do for us. But we got to invite more people into the story. And how he's going to do it is he's going to speak to the common need all of us have, which is the need for purpose. I want to leave you with two real quick observations. Here's my first observation. I believe that the world struggles under the weight of a purposeless existence. Now, I've been a pastor since 1988, and I want to make sure everybody understands in this room. I have never seen a time in my entire public ministry where I have seen such purposelessness in our culture. Record numbers of it. People taking their own lives. People not understanding the meaning of life. In fact, Henry David Thoreau wrote a few centuries back, he said, the mass of humanity live lives of quiet desperation. I think he's exactly right. And I just think we are struggling under the weight of a purposeless existence. And I remember, in fact, a quote I learned a long time ago by Bertrand Russell, who is a famous atheist. And Bertrand Russell basically said this: unless one assumes a God that he didn't believe in, the question of life's purpose is meaninglessness. There's not meaning outside of this idea that there is a God in heaven who wants to fill you with purpose and meaning, and so that you live a life of honor and you build a legacy that you hand off to the world that will go on after you're gone. But I want to challenge you in one more way before I close. Because while I believe that the world struggles under the weight of a purposeless existence, I also believe this: defensive posture Christianity doesn't work. I just believe, to the depth of my being, that too many of us are orienting our faith only around the idea of being a survivor, getting by, getting through. In fact, most of our prayers are just always about safety. And I find it interesting that in the New Testament, the disciples never really prayed for safety. You know what they prayed for? They prayed for courage. And can I just tell you, the way, and this is going to be challenging, the way that most of us are orienting our Christian experience, if the disciples had done that, this is what I believe. You and I, we wouldn't be here. We wouldn't be here. And so really what needs to happen is the church needs to wake up, rise up, find its purpose, and storm the gates of hell itself. That's what ought to be happening. In fact, when Paul was later writing in Colossians chapter 1, verse 16, notice what he said. Everything, absolutely everything, above and below, visible and invisible, got started in God and finds its purpose in Him. And I just wonder what Susanna Wesley, what John Newton, what Florence Nightingale, what Rosa Parks, what Chuck Colson, what Danielle Strickland is in this room who will stand up, step into their purpose, and change the world. Lord Jesus Christ, in this moment, I pray for the power of your Spirit to come and empower your people. I pray, oh God, that as we're here with open minds and open hearts, maybe as just a reflective position and posture of openness, all of us would just place our hands on our laps with our palms pointing up, just as a way to say, God, I'm here and I'm open. I repent of living a defensive posture of Christianity. Fill me with your purpose. God, direct me, like Florence Nightingale said, to find a calling that defines my life. Help me step into this idea, God. You don't just use specific people. You want to use all of us. You want to connect our experiences, our brokenness, our sin, our shame, our expertise, our gifting, our calling, our passion. All of these things working together to move your purposes forward in generosity, in humility, in kindness, and in all the ways you are reshaping this world.